Hey there, this is Ross Izzard. This is the Backcountry Fly Fishing Podcast, where we talk about fly fishing in more interesting places. So we are back with the first full episode here of Season 5. Last week was an intro episode. I talked to you guys a little bit about my trip to Mongolia and about the fact that we got to be on our game if we want to keep even the most wild of places wild. And we're going to talk more about that this season. We'll talk more about stewardship and conservation because those things matter, and there's a lot to say about them. But for now, I would like to kick the season off by talking about the reason we're all here, which is fly fishing. And as you probably have noticed, we are back into fall here, deep fall, really, at this point, coming up on winter. We have made it through that sort of flip season. There might be a few places that are still lingering in the flip season, but for the most part, we're through it. And that means it's time for us to start thinking about the tactics for fishing through the deep fall and the winter. Now, we had a conversation about this, 2 or 3 seasons ago about winter fly fishing. And we talked about, how to fish in the winter generally. And there's going to be some overlap in this episode with that previous episode, but this one is going to be much more focused. This one is going to be very specifically focused on indicators and indicator nymphing. And the reason for that is that that's kind of how you fish in the deep fall and the winter, right? Once the temperatures start going down and the water temperatures start going down, that really becomes the primary tactic for fly fishing, or the primary method, I should say, of fly fishing. And, it's easy enough to say, well, you're throwing an indicator and here's how you set it up and everything else. And we'll cover some of that again today. But I think that there's a lot more detail to be added to it. And I think that there is room for an entire episode all about indicators. Okay, so today, that's what we're going to talk about. We're not just going to talk about indicator fishing, although we are going to talk about tactics and rigging and everything else. We are just going to talk about indicators in general, because it's a huge part of the game, really all the time, unless you're me and then you refuse to nymph in any way, shape, or form until fall and winter roll around. But certainly for where we are now, indicator nymphing is going to be a huge part of what most of you are doing out there. And there's a lot to it. It's like everything else in fly fishing. It can be fairly complicated. There's a lot of stuff you got to think about. And it is worth really digging in and hitting it hard. So that's the plan for today. If you are a Euro nympher and you don't use indicators, then you could listen and still learn some stuff because, hey, maybe the tactic will be useful to you at some point in the future. But if you decide that you don't want to because you're a Euro nymphing fanatic, more power to you. I think you might want to seek professional help, but if that's your thing, then that's cool. This episode might not be for you. For everybody else, let's start talking about indicators. Let's start with the definition of an indicator. Okay, and I know that seems rudimentary and a little bit simplistic, but I think it's worth throwing out there because every now and then I do run into people who are like, what do you mean a strike indicator? And it can mean a bunch of different things, right? It could be a piece of putty on your line. It could be an actual bobber, basically. I mean, let's be real. What we're talking about most of the time is a bobber on your line. It could be like a yarn indicator. There are a whole bunch of things that this could be and could look like. But for the purposes of today's episode, we are talking about something external that is attached to your line, attached to your leader, more specifically, that helps you see when a fish takes your fly. It indicates when there has been eat on your fly. And the reason we use these is because during the fall and the winter, fish are typically not coming up to the surface, right? And that is because there's not a lot hatching. There's not a lot going on. Insect activity really goes down. Yeah, you might have some midge hatches here and there, but that's kind of an exception. For the most part, they're eating larvae subsurface and pupa subsurface. And they're not really moving a lot because trout are cold-blooded. The water's cold. Cold-blooded animals, when they get cold, they're not really trying to move a lot. They're trying to conserve energy. They're trying to be biologically efficient, and they're just not going to move a ton. And that means that you've got to be able to fish subsurface. If you're going to fish subsurface, you have to be able to know when a fish eats your flies, and that requires some type of an indication. And bada bing, bada boom, we have indicators. Okay, so there are a whole bunch of different types of indicators on the market out there, and there are tons of debates about which type of indicator you ought to use, which one's better, which one gives you a better drift, which one doesn't spook fish, which one handles better in different water types. And those are interesting conversations, I guess, but I don't think that they're terribly valuable conversations. I'm going to be completely honest with you guys. Okay. So when I go indicator nymphing, I have a specific type of indicator that I use, and I'm going to tell you about that here in a second, and I'll explain why. But other people use different types of indicators, and that's okay, right? So there are some rules and some things to think about that we're going to cover today. But I also don't think it's rocket science, right? So like if you're out there having debates with your buddy about the Oros versus like the thingamabobber versus the airlock, the truth is they really come down to personal preference. And I'm going to talk about all of those here in a minute to sort of give you a sense of what you're looking for. They're all going to work. They're all probably okay most of the time with some exceptions. And it's just really not worth getting bent out of shape, right? There's nothing nerdier than a couple of fly fishermen standing around arguing over what type of lame bobber they put on their leader, right? Like that, that sucks. And we have better things to talk about. So I'm not going to really get into that, but I am going to talk about those sort of different types of indicators here quickly, specifically in the context of fall and winter fly fishing, so that you can make good informed choices about what you want to use. And that's great. I don't do what you want. I don't need to hear about it later. We don't need to fight about it. You do what you want based on the information. So let's go with this. There are really sort of, in my view, two main types of indicators. And yes, I know there are more. Like I said, there is like the floating putty. There are sighters. There's all kinds of stuff that you can use as an indicator. But in my world, the way that I fly fish, indicators mean something that you are attaching to the line that floats along the surface so that you can see your drift, keep track of your drift, keep track of your flies. And yes, like we said, see when a fish eats your flies subsurface. And really for that purpose, you've got two main big buckets of indicators and then some subdivisions of indicators, right? So let's talk about the two big buckets first. The first one is sort of your bobber indicators, for lack of a better term. These are typically small. They're usually round. Sometimes they're elliptical. Sometimes they're sort of an odd shape. But they are normally sort of bobber-ish, right? And they go on your leader. You set them on your leader based on what kind of depth you want. We'll talk more about that. And then they float along with the flies dragging behind them, right? So they are acting primarily as both an indicator and a suspender a lot of the time. And these indicators I call sort of hard indicators, right? They're made out of something hard. Maybe it's foam, maybe it's plastic, whatever it happens to be. They're made out of something hard. So there's your bucket. You have hard indicators. And then you have what I call soft indicators, right? And so these are like Dorsey indicators and yarn indicators of all kinds. And they are really not as buoyant. They're soft. They're made out of yarn, as the name would imply. I've actually seen them made out of hair, like deer hair and elk hair, which is kind of odd, but it happens sometimes. And they serve the same purpose, but they're slightly different as far as their mechanics in terms of how they work and how effective they are and what you are going to be doing with them. So we're going to kind of talk about each of those buckets in turn, and then we'll move on to some more specific stuff. Let's start with the hard indicators. Okay. So really in this bucket, you have your sort of big three in my mind, which is the Oros indicator, the thingamabobber indicator, and the airlock indicator. They're all hard-sided, buoyant indicators that you attach to your line. The Oros indicator, typically, they have a couple of different models floating around out there, but usually it's like a little foam ball, kind of a soft foam ball. You unscrew the ball in the middle. The leader goes through a channel and a slot in the middle, and then you screw the ball back together, and that's how they work. The airlock indicators are little small balls. They almost look like Christmas tree ornaments. They have a little cap and a O-ring and then a little channel for the leader, and they attach through that channel to your leader. You screw the cap back on, and that's how they go onto your line. And then, of course, you have the thingamabobber, which really needs no introduction, but also attaches to your line through their own sort of unique system. Okay. Now, as far as which of these hard side indicators you need or which one's better, I don't really think it matters, to be perfectly honest. I think you can use any of them, right? I mean, Oros's branding is that these are much lighter. They make a smaller splash, and there probably is some truth to that. The reality is that I think that any indicator is going to make some type of a splash, and I'm really not sure how much of a difference a few grams makes one way or the other if your casting technique is right and you're not slapping that thing on the water. So really, I don't like these all work just fine. Okay. So my personal preference is for an airlock indicator, and that's just because I find them simpler to use. I find that with the Oros indicator, I tend to, like, if my fingers are cold, which happens a lot in the wintertime, I might accidentally drop part of the indicator into the water. Like I drop half the indicator into the water, and now you have one half of a foam ball, and the indicator is functionally useless to you. That sucks. Thingamabobbers, I know they're supposed to be simple to use. The truth is, I've never really found them all that simple to use or to adjust. Maybe I'm just a monkey. I don't know, but I've never really enjoyed using thingamabobbers. They just don't click with my brain, but I understand they click with a lot of other people's brains. And then you have the airlock. And the airlock is, in my view, the easiest for me to use, right? So it is just a little cap. You unscrew it, you run the line through a channel in the screw post there, and then you screw the cap back on, and bada bing, bada boom, you're ready to fish. When you need to move the indicator, you just loosen that screw cap, you slide it up and down the leader. So slide it further down the leader if you need less line and you want the flies to rise shallower. Slide it up the leader if you need more line and you want them to ride deeper. In any case, it just stays on your line all day and you can slide it up and down. That is my preference for the hard indicators. If you drop a cap, which I do often, I'll drop one of those stupid caps when I'm trying to put the line through it. That sucks, but you can also carry extra caps, right? Or you can grab a cap off of another indicator. So rather than the Oros where like you drop half of it and the whole thing is done and useless, you can carry an extra cap for your airlock. You can slap it on there, get right back to fishing. Okay, so I find that easiest. But with all of them, really regardless of what you use for the hard-sided indicators, you want to be thinking about sort of 3 different properties, okay? The first one is buoyancy. So is the thing buoyant enough to, number one, stay afloat even in choppy current, because you will occasionally be throwing into heavier current, visible enough for you to actually be able to see it, because obviously if the goal of an indicator is to indicate that there has been a strike, it would be very difficult for you to know if you can't see it, right? And anybody who's ever fished in a really nasty glare on the river, especially with like sun in your face on a cloudy day, it can be really, really tough to see them. So visibility is another one. And then the last one is size, right? And really size is a proxy for how much disturbance the thing makes on the water, both in terms of when it hits the water and in terms of how large the profile is floating down the river during the drift. And those are all really important. On the buoyancy side, any of those 3 are probably going to be okay, right? Now, I find that the airlocks float a little bit better than the other versions of indicators. I don't know if that's true. I've never tested it. It's definitely possible that I'm just biased, but I find that I see the airlock floating better and more reliably than some of the others, even in harder current. But the reality is they're all probably pretty close, right? I don't know if anybody's ever done a buoyancy test on these various hard indicators, but I'm guessing they're not too far off in terms of how well they float, how much weight they can handle, or anything else. So if you have an opinion about that, shoot me a note. Let me know what you think. But I tend to think the airlocks float a little bit better. I bet they're all pretty darn close. Visibility is kind of a little bit of a different thing, right? So I think that the Oros can be hard for me to see sometimes because they seem to ride a little bit lower in the water column. I don't know exactly why that is. The airlocks tend to flip upside down, so the post where the leader is running through actually rides upside down in the current during the drift. For whatever reason, that makes it a little bit easier for me personally to see. Thingamabobbers, I mean, you can see them, but again, I have other reasons for not really liking to use those. But in any case, whatever indicator you pick, you need to pick one that you can actually see. And this is kind of a more complicated question than you might think it is, because what that means to some people is that they need a bigger indicator. And we'll talk about that here in a second when we get to the size factor, but also that they need a more brightly colored indicator. And the truth is, I do think color matters, right? So you guys know me. I'm usually the guy who's like, we make fly fishing too complicated, and that shit doesn't matter, and that shit doesn't matter. It's not rocket science. Let's just get out there and catch fish. And I do believe that. I really do. But I also do think that this is one of those instances where what you're putting in the water does matter, right? So you're dealing with cold, lethargic fish who are not feeding much, who don't want to move much, and who are not going to risk expending energy, expending calories to go eat something that looks suspicious, right? This is why when you're winter fishing, you have to get the fly right in front of the fish, and it has to be the right fly, because otherwise they're just not going to eat it, right? The risk to them of going after something that's not good food in conditions like that is significant. So they're just not going to do that. And that means that you really want, in my view, the most natural presentation that you can possibly have out there. The fish might not be coming up for dry flies, but they are still looking up. They're still seeing the surface. They're still paying attention to what's around them. I mean, these are things that spend their whole lives attempting not to be eaten by birds and other things that come from outside the water to snatch them up and eat them, right? So they're pre-programmed to be looking out for weird stuff. And I think that is heightened in the wintertime because they just don't have the gas to swim around and get away and be evasive. And that means that you want to be thoughtful about what you're putting in the surface, right? And if you ever go stand by a river and just watch stuff flowing through like a tail out, right? And you can see the white water coming through. It opens up into the tail out, and you'll see like a foam line, right? So a bunch of bubbles and stuff floating down the river. And you'll see a bunch of debris in the river. And you might see bugs in the river, depending on what time of day and time of year you're out there. But one thing you'll notice is that there are not really brightly colored things in the river, right? And in fact, most things floating on the water look white. They might not be perfectly white, but they look white on the surface of the water. Foam is white, bubbles are white. A lot of insects look white on the water if you glance at them. You know, maybe you have some twigs and branches and grass and whatever else floating through there, but it's all pretty naturally colored because, of course, it is natural, right? These are natural things floating down the stream. I think it's important to stick in that vein with your indicator. And that means for me, I always and only use white indicators. Yes, that can make them a little bit harder to see in certain types of current, like whitewater current. Yes, it can make them a little harder to see in situations that have really, really bad glare going on, like sun glare off the water. Yes, I am aware of the fact that there are lots and lots of different colors. There's orange and green and red and yellow, and I see all of them out there when other folks are fishing. And I really do believe, having played around with a lot of these, that the color of the indicator does matter. And I have noticed that I do catch more fish, or at least I believe I catch more fish on a neutral colored white indicator than I do when I'm hanging below a big neon green thing or a neon orange thing or a neon yellow thing. And that makes sense, right? Because those things don't exist in the river. Like there's nothing in nature that is green and yellow or bright blue or purple or red. Like those things don't really exist. And certainly not in the really bright, vibrant pastel colors that usually are what they put on these indicators. And if you're a fish, I mean, just imagine you're a trout at the bottom. And yes, I understand that I'm kind of anthropomorphizing these fish. Of course, I have no idea what a fish is thinking because I've never been in their heads. So I call bullshit if you want. But hey, I've caught a lot of fish. I've been around them for a long time. So bear with me here. But like if I'm a fish and I'm sitting on the bottom of the river and I'm watching I'm tired and I'm cold and I don't want to move and I don't want to risk a calorie expenditure. And so I've gotten kind of picky and I'm watching stuff float down the river all day, right? And suddenly I see two juicy looking bugs floating down toward me. One's a big bug, one's a little bug, and they're floating at about the same exact speed, right? And one's a little bit higher in the column, one's a little bit lower in the column, but they're floating down at me, and the drift is pretty much identical for the two bugs. And then I noticed that drift also happens to be identical to the exact same drift on this really weird bright green object that I've never seen before floating on the surface of the water. I don't think trout are capable of reasoning, but I think that they are well-versed enough, especially in these tailwaters where you're fishing in the winter, especially when they're being highly selective and picky and moody. I do think that somehow or other, they notice that there is a connection between that brightly colored object and these sort of parallel flies drifting in unison toward them with that object. I don't know that. I can't prove it. But what I can tell you is that I do believe it's probably quantifiable, although admittedly I haven't actually gone out there and quantified it. But in my view, having spent many, many, many days indicator nymphing, I do believe that you catch more fish when you are using a neutral colored indicator that does not stand out in the environment and just keeps the fish focused on your flies and not whatever weird UFO they might be attached to, right? I mean, it's kind of like let's say you're walking down the street and like suddenly there's a cheeseburger flying at your face. And that would be pretty weird, right? I suppose you might dodge the cheeseburger because that would be out of the ordinary. But let's pretend that it's normal. You spend all day waiting for cheeseburgers to fly at your face, and that's just how you eat. Now imagine, and you're like, oh, cool, it's a cheeseburger, and you gobble, gobble, you eat it. Now imagine the same cheeseburger is coming at your face at the exact same time as a neon green UFO is flying above the cheeseburger and over your head. And they look like they might be connected or they might be synced up. You probably aren't going to eat the cheeseburger, or at least you're going to have some questions, right? And all a trout needs is questions. So they're not going to really make a big judgment call. They're not going to reason about it. They're not going to say, well, I deduced it. They're just going to not be sure. They're going to have questions about it. And they're going to have questions about your fly hanging off of a bright green object, which is to them the equivalent of a UFO, the same way you would have questions about a cheeseburger hanging off a UFO out here on dry land. Okay, and so I do believe that. Now, whether you choose to believe that or not is up to you. But I think in fly fishing in general, the more variables that you can take off the table, the more successful you're going to be, and the easier it's going to be for you to determine what's working, what's not working, and therefore what you might need to change to get better or to have better fishing. And if you can remove the variable that this brightly colored thing is going to confuse or concern the fish and jack up your fishing, just remove the variable, right? Use a white indicator. That's my philosophy. So you will never see me with anything other than a white indicator on my line. You want to use something else, knock yourself out. I do think it's costing you fish, but we all make our own calls, okay? So that's the second thing. The third thing is size, right? And this is really kind of the same thing as the color discussion, which is to say that the smaller the profile, the better off you're going to be, all right? So the same way that it's not normal to have really brightly colored stuff floating down the river, it's not really normal to have stuff the size of a golf ball floating down the river, right? That's not a normal object. A round spherical object the size of a golf ball or a ping pong ball or whatever is not something that most fish see. It's out of the ordinary, right? So that the same principle we just talked about applies here, where it's like, what's that thing? I don't know if I like it. I think I'm going to stay away from it, and anything that looks like it might be attached to it. I do think that larger indicators cost you fish. I think they're disruptive to the surface. I think they're disruptive to the current. I do think the fish notice them. And again, even though I don't have a spreadsheet proving this, I do believe that there is a quantifiable difference in the number of fish you catch with a large size indicator versus a very small size indicator. And that is why I always use the smallest size hard indicator I can buy. So like the airlocks, I'm always using the smallest airlock I can use, and they're about the size of a marble. They're not very big. That is my advice to folks I fish with. It's always been my preference after experimenting with various sizes and types of indicators. And I think it's worth doing, in part for that reason, because you want it to look natural. You want to remove the variable like we talked about, but also in part because there are other considerations, right? So one thing is, you are going to slap the water hard with an indicator the size of a golf ball than you are with an indicator the size of a marble. And I know I said earlier in the show, it really doesn't matter between like an Oros and a airlock, but that's true only if they're the same size, right? Like, do I believe that the slap or the sound profile or the splash profile of an identically sized Oros and an identically sized airlock is appreciably different enough for me to have a preference between those two things in the same size and color? No, I don't. I think that's a casting question. But do I believe that there is a presentation difference between throwing something the size of a marble and throwing something the size of a golf ball? I absolutely do. The bigger indicators are going to give you bigger splashes. They're going to cause more disruption on the water. And they are, I believe, going to disrupt more fish, especially in that kind of spooky, slower, deeper stuff where the fish are hanging in the cold months. I do believe that they're going to be more disruptive and therefore going to cost you fish. So my general belief on size is that you want to go as small as you possibly can. I've been doing that for years. I'm going to keep doing it. Maybe one day I'll get around to doing the math on it, but I do think that that is the best bet for being effective out there when you're indicator nymphing. And so that's the end of bucket one, right? That's the hard side indicators. Bucket two are the soft indicators. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. I think that they can be great. I think that in situations where you're really worried about spooky fish, having a light indicator that lands almost like a dry fly with no splash can be a real benefit, right? There's definitely something to that. I think that they do a really good job of mimicking natural stuff floating down a river, particularly if they're in white, which again, stay away from the bright colors. But let's say that they're white, you throw them in, they are minimally disruptive to the current. They look pretty natural to the point that I've actually had lots of fish in the warmer months come up and try to eat a yarn indicator when I'm playing with them. And so they do have their role and their place, and they can be great, which is the reason that they're so popular. But they also have some downsides, particularly in the cold months, right? The first one is that I always find them a little bit finicky to get them to stay put on the line. They're adjustable just like the other indicators are, but they don't usually have the same mechanism to screw them down onto the leader the way that those hard indicators do, which means that they are prone to slipping. And you're going to be casting a lot in the winter, right? Because you're trying to hit these little tiny, like 1-inch windows for the fish. So you've got to hit little small micro channels all day to make sure that the fish are seeing your flies and having a chance to eat them. That means you're going to be doing a lot of casting. You're going to have a lot of weight on your line while you're casting. And if your indicator can slip, it's probably going to slip. And there's nothing more irritating than having to stop fishing to be like, oh, damn, it slipped all the way down again. Let me go down and fix it. I have found, at least in my experience, that happens more often with yarn indicators. Now, there might be a type of yarn indicator out there that I don't know about that doesn't have that problem. If so, send me an email, tell me about it. I'll give it a shot. But that's been my experience. And then for that reason, I sort of shy away from them when I'm doing heavy, serious indicator nymphing work. The other thing is that yarn gets wet, right? So like the same way that a fly gets wet, a dry fly gets wet, then you need to put floating on it or put shake on it to make it stay buoyant. That happens with yarn indicators. So you're going to be spending a lot of time potentially shaking that thing and making sure that it stays dry enough to float. They are going to get wet. Yarn does retain water. There's really nothing you can do about it. You're eventually going to have to deal with the buoyancy issue on these things, which is not a factor with hard indicators made out of foam, right? It doesn't matter. They can't get waterlogged, so they just keep floating. But the other issue is the yarn indicators get wet and then they freeze, right? So like if you're outside, water temps are in, let's say 35 or 36, just a few degrees above freezing. And air temps are 15 or 20. You're out there fishing on a cold day. The yarn indicator is going to get wet and then it's going to freeze. And once it freezes, all of the benefits of the yarn indicator go away, right? So now it's got a big chunk of ice on it. So it's heavy. You're going to throw it out there. It's going to make a big splash. That sucks. It's not going to float very well. So the buoyancy is gone. That sucks, right? If your indicator doesn't float, that's not a lot of fun. And also, I think that once they get that ice coating on them, they can get tough to read, to be honest with you. So even if you can get it out there, even if you can avoid the splash, even if it's really mostly still buoyant, something about that additional weight destroys the sensitivity of the indicator, and it can make it really hard to detect these super subtle strikes. And so for that reason, I really don't use yarn indicators in the colder months. I have tried it. I've experimented with it, but these are things that I really save for situations where I need to nymph in warmer months where ice isn't a factor. And I do have good luck with them, but I tend to shy away from them pretty religiously in the wintertime. And I think I'm going to keep doing that. So if you're into yarn indicators and use them in the winter, that's fine. But I think the icing problem is enough on its own to dissuade most people from going the soft indicator route during the winter and during cold weather. As always, you can make your own choice, but that's my philosophy. That's how I fish. All right. So now let's say you've picked your type of indicator, right? You've been through all this brain damage. You have convinced your wife or significant other or friends that you're a psychopath because you're spending your time thinking about which bobber you want to put on your leader the next time you go winter fly fishing. Let's say you got past all of that, right? And somehow managed to retain some type of human relationship, which becomes increasingly difficult as we get more and more into the mental illness that we call fly fishing. But let's say you pulled it off, right? You've selected your indicator, you're out there, you've selected your flies, and what the hell do you do now? Where does the indicator go? And we have talked about this a little bit in the past, so this might be a little bit of a repeat for some of you who have listened to the previous episodes on winter fly fishing, but you want the indicator to be placed such that the flies ride where you want them to ride underneath the surface, okay? And so I think some people get stuck on indicator placement as like some kind of objective truth. Like, well, I always put mine right where the tippet section transitions to the butt section of the leader. Or I always put mine 4 feet above the flies. Or I always put mine here, there, or wherever. And that's really the wrong way to think about it. Okay, you should not be fixing the placement of an indicator really ever, because it defeats the purpose of an indicator, right? Or at least half the purpose, I should say. Because an indicator is, yes, used to indicate a strike, but it is also used to control the drift of your flies. And the most important aspect of that drift is the depth of the flies. And so you're going to hear a bunch of, sort of, I don't know, aphorisms about this, where people are like, well, it should be 2 times the depth of the water you're fishing, or 1.5 times the depth of the water that you're fishing. And there's probably a little bit of truth to that, but honestly, you can drive yourself crazy standing there looking in the water and going, well, I think that's about 3 feet deep. So that means I'm going to have to, and you break out your scientific calculator. And you're like, well, I should put that at 4.5 feet, but maybe it should be 5. I don't think you need to do that, right? If that's a helpful reference for you and it helps you make a decision, great, knock yourself out. I don't think it has to be that complicated, right? My general philosophy is to look at the water that I'm going to be fishing, make an educated guess about how deep that water is, and then put the indicator at very slightly more than whatever I think that depth is, right? So I'm not trying to do math. Like if I walk up and I look at a run and I'm like, I think that's about 2.5 feet deep, I'm probably going to put the indicator about 3 feet above the flies, right? And the reason you put it a little bit further up, the same reason these other pieces of wisdom exist about 1.5 times or 2 times, is that the flies don't ride directly below the indicator, right? Because there's current involved. You're not throwing them into a lake or still water where they would just hang from the indicator. They're riding kind of behind it if you're casting right. And we're going to talk a little bit more about casting and placement here in just a minute. But assuming that you're casting right and you have the indicator landing first with the flies behind it, so upstream of it in that drift, those flies, if you can picture the indicator at the top and then the leader coming off from the indicator at the bottom and then going down to your terminal tippet and your flies, that's going to be at an angle. It's not going to be straight down, right? The line is going to angle back into the current, and the flies are going to be sort of trailing or dragging behind this indicator. And because it's at an angle, you are not going to get maximum depth, right? So if the water is 3 feet deep and you only do 3 feet of space between the indicators and the flies, the chances are your flies are not near the bottom. They're probably riding 2 feet down instead of all 3 feet down. And so building a little bit of extra distance into that, or extra length into the bottom side of your indicator, can help you really make sure those flies are getting down deep, because that's what you want. In general, you want these flies to be close-ish to the bottom, to the strike zone, where those cold lethargic fish are sitting and feeding. You're probably going to get this wrong a lot of the time, right? Like, it can be hard to judge how deep water is. And anybody who's ever stepped into water and been like, oh, that looks like it's 2 feet deep, and then it's 4 feet deep, you know how this goes, right? It can be tricky. Looks can be deceiving. And so you're really going to have to kind of feel it out. Some of it will be gut instinct. The more that you do it, the more comfortable you're going to get at eyeballing it. But some of it is going to be just seeing what happens, right? So if you throw this in and your flies come along and they hang up in the first 5 seconds of the drift, or if you're pulling them up and they're covered with algae or vegetation or weeds or whatever, then you know they're probably riding too close to the bottom, right? They should not be snagging bottom on every single drift. That probably means that you want to move your indicator down on the leader, shorten that distance on the terminal tippet and that last bit of the leader, and raise the flies up in a column a little bit, right? Similarly, if you are throwing it over and over again and you can see the fly and you see that the fly is not getting deeper than maybe a couple feet or 3 feet and you need something deeper than that, then it's probably time to move the indicator up, right? And give yourself more line so those flies can sink more. But in any case, you're going to be sort of eyeballing it. And of course, you have the third indication, which is that you're not catching fish, right? And the truth is, yes, fish can be assholes in the wintertime. They're hard to catch. In a lot of cases, they might not be feeding, yada, yada, yada. But in most cases, if you are not catching fish, it has less to do with your flies and less to do with whether or not there are fish there, and a lot more to do with where your flies are in the column, which is an indicator question, right? So if you've been spending an hour, I really hope you don't spend the full hour fishing the same water, because that would be a waste of your time, especially if you're not catching fish. But everybody gets to fish how they want, so knock yourself out. Well, if you've been out there for 45 minutes or an hour and you're throwing it back, you're really not getting any action, you, number one, should probably move to a new spot. But number two, if you insist on staying in that spot and you're like, damn it, I'm going to catch this fish, you need to be thinking about depth. And I will almost guarantee you that if you're not dealing with snags and hangups and vegetation on your flies and you're not catching fish, you are not deep enough to catch the fish. You're not getting down close enough to them. And so finding that balance, finding that right placement for the indicator where your flies are near the bottom and maybe even ticking the bottom every now and then, but not hanging up all the time, not coming up covered with seaweed, but still deep enough to be in the strike zone, that's the sweet spot. And you're going to have to jiggle with it to make it happen, right? This is an imprecise science. We're putting a piece of plastic bullshit on our leaders to catch fish. It's more art than science, and it's going to take practice. And you're going to have to change all the time, right? So like maybe right now you're fishing a tail out and it needs to be 4 feet above the flies. You move downstream a tiny bit. Now you're fishing a pool. It needs to be 5 feet above the flies. And then you go a little further down and you're fishing a shallower section. Now it needs to be 1 foot above the flies. And yes, I will occasionally put the indicator in shallow water all the way down to, maybe a foot above the flies because I want them to ride above that bottom or higher in the column. You're going to have to be dynamic about it. If you refuse to move your indicator, if you're a fixed indicator guy, like by God, I put it on this spot every time, might as well mark it with a Sharpie, you're just not going to catch that many fish. I'm sorry, that is going to be reflected in your efficiency and your productivity. If you want to be catching the maximum number of fish out there, you're going to have to be flexible. And that means you're going to have to adjust the most important factor, which is depth. And that means you're going to have to adjust your indicator. So you'll figure this out as you go. Start getting in the habit of paying attention to how deep the water is, where you think the flies need to go, paying attention to the indications of whether or not those flies are in the correct zone, and really spend your time working on getting an eyeball sense going for that stuff, and then be willing to change. And those couple things alone are going to make an enormous difference for your ability to fish effectively through the colder months. Now, let's talk about the last piece of this, which is, and we can, if you guys want to talk about rigging, we can. You can also go back and listen to the episode about winter fly fishing where I talk quite a bit about fly selection and how I set this up. The very short version for you here today, just in case you missed that episode and want the cliff notes, is I typically fish 2 flies in sort of a tractor trailer configuration. I have one big fly. It's very often a size 10 or 12 pass rubber leg stonefly. Sometimes it's a crabfly larva. Sometimes it's something else. But a big fly that I call the porterhouse steak fly, which looks like a big enough, juicy enough meal to get a hungry, lethargic trout to come up and take a risk for a big bite. And then I will trail off of that about 12 to 15 inches behind what I call a chicken nugget fly, which is probably like a size 22 zebra midge, or maybe a size 20 prince nymph, or whatever, or a hare's ear, whatever it happens to be. And that one is covering the other bases, which is the smaller insects the fish might move for. Sometimes the fish will come up and eat the porterhouse fly. I catch a lot of fish in the wintertime on big flies. That always surprises people. I actually was out just a couple of days ago and I had a guy come up and be like, man, what are you catching them on? And I said, size 10 Pat's rubber legs. And he said, I don't have anything in my box that's bigger than an 18, because everybody is so used to fishing tiny flies on these tailwaters. I gave him a couple of Pat's rubber legs, bada bing, bada boom, dude's catching fish. So sometimes they'll come up and eat the porterhouse. Sometimes it's enough to get them to come look and they're like, I don't know if I want to do that. But then they see the chicken nugget fly coming and they're like, oh, well, that looks okay. And they eat that one. But in any case, it's effective enough that that's almost always how I'm rigged. There are exceptions, of course. Fly fishing is the sport of exceptions. I'm not saying that that's 100% of the time, but it's probably 85% of the time. That's how I'm rigged up. I keep the flies heavy, bead heads on them whenever I can. If they don't have bead heads, or if I'm fishing very fast current or I need to get them down fast, I will put on 1 or 2 small split shots about 6 inches above that lead fly to really help sink it. I try not to use split shot when I don't have to, because I think the less stuff you have on your line, the better off you're going to be, going back to that variables conversation. But, I do use split shot on occasion if I need it. And maybe at some point we'll do a whole episode just about split shot. But that should give you a sense of kind of how I rig this thing up. And like I said, go back and listen to the episode about winter fly fishing if you want a more detailed explanation of the theory behind that. But setting all that aside, I want to talk about the last piece of this, which is how to cast and place an indicator, and then how to control the drift, right? So the tactical side of indicator nymphing. We did not really get into this in the last winter fly fishing episode, and we should have, because it's really important, right? Like if you don't put it in the right place, you don't cast it the right way, you don't control the drift, chances are you're going to have a bad time. Because just like any other type of fly fishing, fly placement and drift are the two most important factors when it comes to presentation. Presentation is by far the most important factor when it comes to catching fish, and it's worth thinking about. So let's start with this. You want to make sure that your indicator lands downstream of the flies, right? That means that you do not want the flies to land across stream from the flies. You definitely don't want the flies to land downstream of the indicator. You don't want them to land in a pile together. You want a nice, clean layout where the indicator lands first, and then you have 2 splashes from the flies behind it, or 1 splash or 4 splashes, however many flies you happen to have on it, or split shot. But in case, you want the plop of the indicator and then the splashes behind it of the flies entering the water. And in order to pull that off, you really have to be focused on fishing upstream. And of course, we've talked about this before. Fishing upstream is the norm in fly fishing because you're coming up from behind the fish. They can't see you. It's much stealthier. It allows you to get better presentations and better drifts. And that's the same in indicator nymphing in the wintertime. But it's even more important because you're not really controlling the drift. The indicator is controlling the drift, right? Those flies are sort of at the mercy of where the indicator goes. And if they are not behind it, trailing behind it, then it's not really in control and things start getting sloppy. You start getting all kinds of different drag. You can get tangles. It gets gross. So you really need to focus on fishing upstream. And when you make that cast, it can be a water load cast because you have a bunch of weight on your line, and it can be sort of a pain in the ass to, fly cast a big heavy indicator rig with big flies and split shot. But it could be a fly cast. It might be a roll cast. It really doesn't matter what type of cast you're making here. You need to have your body facing upstream, and you need to be throwing it upstream. And the goal is for all of this stuff, your entire rig, to land in a straight line upstream, right? So indicator, split shot, flies, or indicator, flies, flies, whatever it might be, they need to land in a line with the flies upstream of the indicator, and they need to all be in the same seam. So if you're fishing the edge of a tail out, if you're fishing really any piece of current, a piece of bank water or the sides of a pool, it all needs to be in the same seam. If you don't do that, if you do what I see most people do when they go out indicator nymphing, and you throw it like kind of upstream, like quartering upstream, you are going to get jacked up drifts, right? Because now the flies are landing across stream from the indicator. They're probably crossing the seam that you're fishing. They might be in a totally different seam or a different current pattern, and the indicator is not in control. Those flies are now, they might be ahead of the indicator. They might be floating alongside the indicator or whatever else. They are not going to get a clean drift. And number one, that probably means you're not going to catch a fish in the first place. But number two, if you do catch a fish with a shitty cast like that, you're probably not going to know, right? Because the indicator doesn't really work until a fish comes up, eats the fly, and then moves all of that leader and tippet material enough to move the indicator, right? And even in the best case scenarios, you were talking about tiny movements, right? Like the indicator flips over, or it pauses for half a second, or it just bloops just a tiny bit. It might not be, and in fact, it usually isn't a big goes underwater because a shark just ate it kind of moment. It's a subtle thing, and it's subtle because the fish are just kind of sipping those flies, sipping them. And if the setup of your rig is wrong, the flies are in the wrong position relative to the indicator, there's slack in the system somewhere, they're in different current seams, it becomes very difficult to try to interpret what the indicator is telling you, right? It's like trying to read a book through 2 sets of mirrors. It's just very difficult to read what's going on because it's not contextualized in the same plane, right? It's sort of separate current seams, separate sections of water. You don't really know what's happening. And that means, number one, you might not see anything. And number two, even if you do see something, you might misinterpret it or you might miss it because it just isn't clean. So you need to be casting upstream. You want all of that stuff landing in a straight line in the same seam. And then you want to let it go through that drift with as little drag on the indicator as you can possibly manage, right? If you get the cast wrong and the flies are out of position, it really doesn't matter, because no matter how perfect the indicator float is or the indicator drift is, you're still having drag subsurface on the flies themselves. So you're probably cooked. But even if you get a perfect layout, right, and everything's great, if you introduce drag to the indicator, you are going to introduce drag to the flies. And what usually happens is the indicator, because the surface current is moving much faster than the current below the surface, if you get drag on the indicator, the flies will catch up to the indicator. They might even pass in front of the indicator. And now you have the same exact problem that we had before. They're no longer in line. The indicator is no longer in control. You can't really read it anymore. Probably going to cost you some fish. So you want to really avoid drag on the indicator, and you want to focus on the fact that you are fishing the indicator, not the flies. You really need to care about the indicator itself. Get the placement right, then care about the indicator. And there are two ways to do that. Really, there are probably more than two ways to do it, but we're just going to cover the main two. The first one is tight lining to the indicator. And yes, I know that this can be like a trout bitten Euro nymphing mono rig thing. Okay, fine. But that's not what I'm talking about, right? I'm talking about traditional fly fishing with fly line involved and using an indicator. You throw it out there, and my goal in general, if I can make it work, if I can actually make the distances involved work, and if my rod is the right length, my goal is to not have any fly line on the water at all. And if I can avoid it, not have any leader on the water at all. So I'll be holding the rod up, holding the line up, and there's nothing else influencing the drift of that indicator except for the current. It is a nice, clean, dead drift, which, as long as the flies are in the right spot, translates to a nice, clean, dead drift on the flies. That is my goal, right? And you can do that probably out to, I want to say, about 20 feet before it starts getting funky, right? Eventually you start getting a line sag from the fly line, or you're crossing too many current seams, or you can't reach that far, whatever might happen. It does eventually get funky at longer distances, but I'd say like 15, 20 feet, which is about as far as I'm really fishing most of the time. This works really well. And I do think that keeping the line off the water and keeping a tight line to the indicator is probably, by and large, the most effective way to preserve your drift, and therefore the most productive way to indicator nymph. That's my goal. In some cases, though, that's not going to be the case, right? So you might have to throw fly line into the mix, and there are a couple of times that this might happen. One could be that you need a longer drift on an upstream cast. So like maybe you, for whatever reason, need to position yourself 30 feet below the actual run that you're fishing, and the section that you're fishing. You are probably going to have to put some fly line out there, right? You want to be careful not to line the fish, obviously, but you may have to lay some fly line out. That means you're going to lay it out directly upstream of you, and then you're going to have to retrieve that fly line as it comes back to you to keep the drag off of it and keep everything clean. So you may have to manage it that way, or you're going to wind up making longer casts across the river or across current seams to other sections, right? So this could be a pool or a bend or something on the far side of the river where you're making a cast and you're trying to get a good drift, and you have to be able to mend. This is difficult because you need to be casting upstream, right? So it can be hard to position yourself in a place where this is even possible. But in any case, let's say you're throwing it into a pool at a bend of the river, and there's like kind of a strong current coming off of a rock or an eddy, and you've got to lay some fly line out because you really need to get some distance. Well, now you're going to have to mend. And if we're being real, a lot of us are really shitty at mending, okay? A lot of people mend instinctively because they've had a guide yell, mend, mend, mend at them somewhere. And that's okay. Mending is good, but you don't always have to mend. And in fact, I think if you can avoid mending wherever you can, you're better off. But when you do have to mend, you need to do it thoughtfully, okay? And so I think, let's say in that scenario, you're throwing across the current seam into stiller water or slower water. You need to be throwing a really big upstream mend into that line almost immediately. You can do it in an airborne fashion in a lot of cases. I try to do that. But even if that doesn't work, you need to be throwing a big upstream mend into it if you can manage it. Same thing if you happen to be fishing, let's say you're standing at the edge of a pool and fishing to the current seam on the other side of that same tail out or seam or whatever it happens to be. You might have to throw where you have slower water between you and faster water. And that means you are going to have to start throwing downstream mends because you don't want your slower water to drag your fly line, which then allows the rest of it to get too far down, starts to create drag in the faster current. You need to be able to mend downstream there. And we can have a whole conversation about mending. In fact, at some point, we probably should have a whole episode about mending, and we'll talk about it. So I'll put that on the list, and we'll think about adding it. But do think about whether you're mending, whether you are tight lining, whether you're throwing upstream, whatever it is. Your goal is to keep, number one, position the flies right. I know I've said it 100 times, but I really want to emphasize that. If you don't get that right, nothing else will work. But if you do that, then you really need to focus on keeping the drag off the indicator. And this is especially important in indicator nymphing. It's especially important in the winter when the fish are picky and moody. And it's something that you really need to focus on. So if you're not thinking about that now, if you're just lobbing the bobber out there and it lands where it lands and we'll see what happens, probably not the right way to do it. If you are not paying attention to how the bobber is being affected and instead preoccupied by where the flies are, probably not going to work out great. If you're not giving a shit about mending your line and you're like, it doesn't matter because it's on a bobber and who cares, you're probably not going to catch very many fish. Okay, so really focus on getting a clean, drag-free drift on that indicator. And so long as everything else is right, that means you're getting a clean, drag-free drift on the flies. That probably translates into more fish caught. And I think that's it, guys. I mean, we could talk a lot more. There's a lot more to say about this, but we've been talking for 55 minutes about indicator nymphing, which some people might consider a fate worse than death. But hey, it's an important part of fly fishing, and it's something that's worth talking about. So I hope this was helpful to you. I know it was pretty detailed. I know a lot of you probably knew a fair amount of it, but it's important enough for us to spend some time digging into it. And I hope you learned something from it. So have a great week. Get out there and fish. Take care of yourselves. And I will see you back here, same time, next week. Till next time, this is Ross. Maybe I'll see you out there. But I better not see you throwing a 6-inch green indicator that looks like a Christmas ornament.